You sound so clear.
I'm sorry?
Nothing, never mind.
Oh.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's discussion. My name is Andrew Douglas. I'm from Bryn Mawr Film Institute, and with me is our guest moderator, whose introduction I'm sure you watched, Andrew Karasik. Andrew, how are you?
Doing very well, Andrew. Thanks for having me, as always. Honored to be a part.
Well, we're glad to have you, and I'm sure a lot of us appreciate that you picked this movie this week, which we'll get into in just a moment. Just a few reminders to people. Please keep yourself on mute unless you are the person speaking, and you'll know when you're the person speaking because I'll call on you, and I will call on you because you should have a little icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you can raise your hand. When you raise your hand, after I call on you, please remember to unraise your hand or lower your hand. And that way I won't call on you again and you won't have to say, I don't have anything else to say. We also got some questions over email before today, so we will get into some of those as well. But, and as well, I should mention that my colleague Jill is also monitoring the chat. So that is something that people can utilize for a comment as well. I see there's one comment that someone can't hear. I think if it's just one person, that might be their computer in some way. Can other people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Good to know. So,
yeah.
Great. Thank you. So does anybody want to get us started off with a comment or a question about Rocky? If so, please raise your hands within Zoom. I can't actually see you if you're raising your hand in your home in front of your computer. If not, I think that we can start off with one of the questions we got online, which may generate some further questions. And frankly, it's a really, I think, in some ways, it's the question to ask about the film. It came from Barbara, who asked, why do you believe Rocky became such a huge and enduring success? And I think that, Andrew, you discussed some of this in your introduction, but if you could, I guess, briefly touch on those points, as well as any other ones you didn't mention, I think some people might benefit from hearing them.
Sure. Barbara, thanks for that question. Good evening again, everyone. It's a great question to start with because it really is kind of the crux of where I approached my introduction, and that is, how did this kind of film become such a sleeper hit and such a success? Now, what we have to remember is when we look at the film now, it's considered a blockbuster. We look at it as kind of your typical Hollywood, a major mainstream film, and a lot of that's from its sequels, and a lot of that's from it as a franchise and a tentpole film, rather than itself as the original. But if we actually go back to 75 and 76, and 76 when it was made, and the time in pre-production and things like that, and we think about how this really was an art house, what we call indie film, as it were, this initial early on starting. If you think about it that way, like kind of is indicated in the introduction, but also here, it's not really I don't think a lot of people necessarily saw success. I mean, obviously, some of the producers did. Some of the people who originally read the screenplay had to. They offered a sizable sum to an unknown writer to purchase the film. But why all of a sudden did it become this sleeper hit? And what I think that goes to is kind of what we talked about, and that is that this is post-Watergate, post-Vietnam. It's an era of incredibly cynical film. Widely considered to be one of the best years for Best Picture nominees. If you just simply take the four of them, Rocky, you've got All the President's Men, Taxi Driver, and Network. Three of the four, not including Rocky, are pretty cynical films. All the President's Men, a little bit of a darker, maybe not as cynical as more kind of uncover the truth, follow the money. But with the rest of them, you're really looking at this kind of cynical, darker depiction post-Watergate, post-Vietnam. Rocky comes along, and like we kind of talk about, it's this picture of Americana. It's a underdog story, Cinderella story, whatever you want to call it, that kind of rises from the ashes of this downtrodden boxer who's able to become something more. He's able to follow that American dream. And I think that was what America was yearning for at the time. At some point, we can only take so much cynicism, so much kind of darkness. And if you actually think about this, this has happened in other eras as well. I would say 2008 is a great example where you had a film like Slumdog Millionaire that starts off dark but does have a pretty glorious and uplifting ending come along. And right then we're dealing with, the financial crisis and all of that. And that was kind of this surprise picture that went on to win Best Picture when it was surrounded by darker films like Frost Nixon and things like that. So I do think that there are times when we're yearning for that.
I think it's a really good point, Andrew, and sort of building on that, I think that one of the charming things about Rocky, one of the reasons a film can become enduring is because it is the right fit for the moment, for the time. And I think that that's what you were getting at, Andrew, and you certainly you pointed out another example. I remember I had a professor in college who was thoroughly convinced that the reason the Beatles were so overwhelmingly successful when they premiered in the US in early '64 and were embraced with the mania that they were, was because the country was reeling and depressed from the assassination of President Kennedy. And that there can be these moments where it's not necessarily uniquely about the film, it's a combination of the culture and the movie being a good fit. I think the other thing about Rocky that's interesting is the character's optimism, right? The movie obviously has the ending it has, and he is successful in that endeavor, but he's got an open mind and an open heart, and for someone in his circumstances, a pretty positive outlook for much of the movie, which in and of itself can be quite refreshing. I'm curious about, we got a question in the comments or the chat asking, pointing out in your intro, you said that was the only ending that sort of could have happened with the film at that time. But how would it be different today? How would it have been different if it came out in the 40s or 50s, an era when there were a number of boxing films? Can you speak to that a bit, Andrew?
Absolutely. I made this point specifically, and it is really one of my key points in the film. So first off, I'll kind of answer the question of how do I think it would differ today? And I think if you made this film today, especially if it was being made large studio and with the goal of being uplifting, I think Rocky would win. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that Rocky II comes along, is somewhat similar of a film, a little bit of a more uplifting message, but Rocky does win. And I'm also reminded of another film, obviously not in the same caliber as Rocky, but Dodgeball, a true underdog story. In the original script of that film, they lost. And the message of the film was basically, sometimes you try, sometimes you lose. And the studio came along, and this is 2004, the studio said, absolutely not. There's no way we're going to make a film with that kind of an ending after a comedy. and they were forced to change it to this uplifting ending where it turns out he bet, and if you've ever seen the movie, you know how that ends. But the reason to me why Rocky works so well is because he doesn't win. And when you actually spend the time analyzing the film, and you actually, long after the credits roll, you think to yourself, well, wait a second, he didn't actually win the fight. And it's also a bit of a love letter to boxing in that regard, because in boxing, there's multiple ways to win. Obviously, there's the knockout, and there's going the distance, and then winning on based on the judges. And it's often considered that if you can last the 15 rounds or the 12 rounds in boxing, if you can get to that judges, then you've pretty much done your job. It's still considered to this day. Yes, maybe you don't walk away with that heavyweight title, but at that point it becomes a little bit of kind of how do the judges feel, who did a better job, and they score it round by round, and then it goes to that. So it's basically if you can survive without a knockout, it goes to that next point. And I think Rocky touches on that a little bit. But at the same time, what I was actually rewatching the film yesterday, and I was watching it with the captioning on, which is always fun. And as I'm watching the very last scene, there's a lot of talking going on. And there's actually more dialogue there than you probably realize, including the scores that Apollo receives, Apollo saying things back and forth. But the only real thing we see or care about is when he's yelling for Adrian, Adrian's yelling for him, she loses her hat, comes into the ring, Paulie lets her in the ring, and they embrace. That's the end of the film. And even though there's all this other going on, and it's actually Apollo, if you look in the background, obviously out of focus, with his arms up, actually celebrating his victory, and yet Rocky is there having known that he did what he set out to do. And to me, that goes back to the message of the film and why it's such a good film, because it doesn't actually win. I mean, what other great uplifting film do you have where, in the end, the guy loses? But it's, to equate it to a piece of history, it's like Lincoln in 1858. He lost the Senate, but became such a known figure that by 1960 he was able to win. It's a little similar to that in that regard, that he did what he set out to do. And again, if we take it to this American dream motif, which we'll get into, you don't necessarily win, but the American dream at least promises you a shot. When the immigrants come over and they think the streets are paved with gold, they all want to be something, but they're not all going to get there. But at least they're going to have all had that shot to do that.
I think the one of the points you made is interesting is that the film clearly has Stallone's clearly has some respect for boxing, and I think one of the reasons that Rocky can't win, is that he holds not just Creed, but that title that Creed holds in such high esteem. And it would almost diminish the whole endeavor if someone like him with a limited amount of training and experience were able to win. So in a sense, it's sort of an acknowledgement of, or a representation of his view of boxing, I think. Did you have another comment on that?
I was just going to say, at that point, it raises the questions of, if he wins, does he really actually become the heavyweight? Like you said, it complicates the message of the film. And obviously, at the end of 2, he does win, and the story progresses. But I like to this is one of the only films that I really like to look at devoid of its sequels. It's not that the sequels are bad films. It's just that I look at this film kind of as its own story and its own bookend. And the film bookends itself nicely. Begins with a fight, ends with a fight. It kind of is its own story that gets expanded because of the commercial success. The studio didn't realize it was going to make so much money, and having worked on the business side of film, you have a film that makes money, you're going to make a sequel whether it's artistically the right decision or not.
Richard, you have your hand up.
Yes, as I understand it, the film was made on a low budget, I think $1 million or so, and they had to do it in 28 days. And apparently there are a lot of mistakes in it. I think the camera boom is in one area, and they didn't have enough money for extras for the crowd at the Spectrum, and they had, but I never noticed that. And I also thought that there were a couple things they could have done where you don't see why he reconciles with the manager when he sort of throws him out of his apartment. That's left out. And you're really not sure that Creed really isn't training for this. So I think there are a lot of things that if you're doing it again and had money and could reshoot, you might have done it, but it doesn't make any difference. So I'm wondering if on today's budgets, they're budgeting, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars for a film. Doesn't the point of diminishing returns come in really too early?
Well, it depends. I mean, you're absolutely right. $1 million in 1976 is a low budget. To put it in perspective, that was about the budget of On the Waterfront in 1954. So even though the budgets in Hollywood in the 70s were not what they would become even just a couple of years later after the success of Star Wars and Jaws, that is a low budget. And it's that budget because Stallone wouldn't sell the rights to make the film from the screenplay he wrote if he wasn't allowed to star in it. And having him star in it, or having Robert Redford or Burt Reynolds or another huge star of that time, sort of dictates, at least in a producer's mind, and Andrew, you would know better than I would as a producer, that then we got to sort of ratchet down our budget and our expectations. And I think you do see that at different points in the movie. That being said, that aesthetic sort of fits with the movie. And Richard, to your point about diminishing returns, I mean, certainly you're right. It depends. I mean, the movies that cost $100, $200, $250 million, they're not, boxing pictures sort of, about a scrappy up and comer. I mean, pick whatever Hollywood movie about boxing, the Fighter from a number of years ago or what have you, even The Wrestler, which isn't boxing, but is kind of similar. Those budgets were in the tens of millions, but I would wager certainly under 50. And so they're not doing the same thing. But that being said, I think you will find in those films, you don't see the sort of, kind of production mistakes that you did find in this one. And it does have to do with being able to go back to them. Andrew, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have a couple points on this. I actually am going to spend a little bit of time on this because I think it's very important. If you've taken a class with me, I've often described a successful film as lightning in a bottle. And if you've ever even made an amateur film or anything like that, you may know what I'm talking about, where it's this feeling that everything just happens to be going right. And even when you make mistakes, those mistakes seem to work. And I'm going to talk about that specifically with this film. One of my favorite scenes in this film happens completely by chance. And by chance, I mean it happens by mistake. And that is, there is a scene towards the end where Rocky enters the arena. It's about early in the morning, and Miles Juergens is there. And he points up and he says, "Look, those are the wrong trunks. I'm wearing the other color." Obviously, movies are shot out of order. So the scene feels a little bit maybe out of place, but it's brought together by Juergens' line. It doesn't really matter what you're wearing. You're going to give him hell anyways. And then that transpires to give Rocky this thought of, well, he realizes he's not going to win. He realizes he really doesn't matter, or at least in his mind, all that matters is can he go the distance. So how does that scene come about? Well, the props department made a mistake. They made that poster, but they reversed the colors in the poster. In the poster, I believe it's white with a red stripe, and in the actual fight, it's a red with a white stripe. The other way around, pardon me. But the fight's already filmed. Props department makes a mistake, and they don't have money to do it again. They don't have money to make that poster again. And so what ends up happening is they actually write this scene into the movie, because otherwise there's going to be this poster that's wrong in this climactic battle of the film that's going to be there. So they actually end up writing this scene into the movie, and it ends up being such a poignant, really great scene, but it's actually written into the movie for that. And it's what I call economies of scale. What's really, and you bring up some really good points, Richard, what's really amazing about this film is I think that why it's such a good film and why I love it so much is because of its mistakes, because it is so very compact in its design. If you go and you watch the rest of the Rocky films, they feel very much like your studio tentpole blockbuster films. For Rocky, I can't even watch Rocky 4 because it takes a character I love and it just kind of goes ridiculous with it. But here, it makes mistakes. And what I think is a nice testament here to this film is it may make all those mistakes, but you don't really care. And this is kind of what you were hinting at, is in the end, it's not that big a deal. The film still works. You know, yes, there might be a boom in a shot. Yes, there are scenes where the fighting is not realistic. There are shots where you can obviously see that they're reacting. But it all works. And that's what's so amazing to me about this film. We'll talk about this because I saw somebody mention the montage as well, and I'm sure we'll get to this. But I was watching the film yesterday with a friend who has never seen the film before and wasn't really into the film. And as the montage came on, I said, look, whatever you think of the film right now, I want you to watch this next 2 minutes, and I want you to tell me how you feel. Do you care about the story? How do you feel? They watched the training montage, having seen the failure up the steps of the art museum to the success up the steps. They said, okay, I just got chills. I don't even like this movie, and I just got chills. That's how good that one scene is, that it really doesn't matter what happens. If you're actually paying attention to the film, you're hooked at that point. And from there, it starts to get pretty. It starts to go on. And one thing about, if I can just, and it's a little off topic, but about the artistic side of the film, if you actually go back and watch the film, and I hope you will, the film changes its color temperature during the montage. So up until that point, it is a very dark film. There is not a lot of light let into the camera. There's not a lot of light let into the scene. During the montage, all of a sudden the sun comes out and it's bright, and every scene after that is bright. And that's not by happenstance. That is a brilliant director realizing that he can control how the audience is going to feel about a scene. You have this darkness of a scene that, and the 1970s Philadelphia, the dilapidated skyline, the way the city was then, and then all of a sudden he's training, the sun comes out, and now this brightness permeates the screen. He goes up, he throws up his arms, and everything changes. And that's what really makes a great film. So you don't need a gigantic budget to do it. I prefer much smaller budgeted films. Now you can't make a boxing film for, I've had boxing films pitched to me, and I can't see budgets for less than, 3 or 4 million with makeup and things like that. But it's pretty amazing what they did here, and I think it made a film better.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Jonathan, you have a question or comment?
A couple of things.
John, could we start with just one, and we'll go?
Sure,
Thank
sure.
you.
Okay, more important then. It seemed to me that the boxing was clearly integral to this film, but it was the vehicle for the development of this character. And I found myself at the end, what really grabbed me at the very end was not so much the end of the fight, which was wonderful, but the relationship between Rocky and Adrian, which is, I think, really, without that, the film doesn't hold up. And I think that was really certainly the emotional core of the whole thing. Yes, Rocky had this aspiration, given this chance, but it was that relationship that really carried it at the end.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I appreciate the comment. I mean, in some ways, all movies that, I shouldn't say all movies, but many movies that are thought of as being about one thing are really about something else. People are right when they call this a boxing film. It certainly is a boxing film, but it's really about much more than that, and arguably something besides that. I think along the lines of some of the ways Andrew's talked about looking at movies, I always like to sort of look at where a movie starts and where it begins. And while this movie begins and ends, as Andrew said, with boxing, it really has to do with the arc and journey of the Rocky character. And I think the relationship with Adrian is integral to that. Andrew, do you have thoughts on this point?
I do. And I think Rocky is widely considered one of, if not the best sports film. On the AFI poll, it was Rocky, and then Raging Bull was number one. And what it comes down to when you're making a film like this if you have to care about the characters, especially in the 1970s were about a character study. If you look at the films that are winning, Best Picture, you have One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you've got Network with Howard Beale's character. That was what the 70s were about, with these kind of telling a story through a major character. To me, yes, it's a boxing film, but it's much more a love story. It really is about the relationship of the two of them. And then what I kind of hinted at is it's about these four misanthropes who each kind of go through a character arc. Now, Paulie is the least character arc, and this was asked in one of the emailed questions in. And Paulie doesn't go through the same level of a character arc, but Mickey does. Mickey grows. And, of course, Adrian does. And that character arc is very important. Especially even, I would say Adrian's character arc is almost, if not as important as Rocky's. And it's done symbolically as well. There's a very, when they go at the end of their date on Thanksgiving and they go back to the apartment, Rocky asks Adrian to remove her glasses, which is your standard, she's all that. Oh my God, there's a beautiful woman behind there. But he also does something else, and it's very important. He asks her to remove her hat. And that hat becomes symbolic because if you recall, at the very, very end of the film, as she's running through the crowd to get to Rocky, her hat flies back. And they actually did that with fishing wire. They had a set hand who actually pulled the hat back because it was so important that this hat actually fly back at the right time. So why does she lose her hat again? Because at that point, she's given up on whatever it is. She knows that the most important thing to her is Rocky. The most important thing to him is her. The man literally just as is said by the announcer, you've just witnessed the greatest showing of stamina in the history of boxing. Rocky has literally stunned the world, and it's one of my, and I just have to say, because if I don't get a chance to say it, but one of my other favorite shots of the movie is where, and Carl Weathers does so well, when Rocky gets up again. And Carl Weathers is just like, I can't believe it. He just has this dumbfounded look. Apollo has this dumbfounded look of, I can't believe this guy. How is this happening? And it's just so well done at that point. Yet the only thing Rocky cares about, he's won, he's being interviewed, he's got a chance to pretty much make a name for himself. He says, get out of my face. The only thing he cares about is Adrian. He wants to see the woman that he's fallen in love with. And she wants to see him. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful ending.
Dana, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I do. It's surprising to me that it hasn't come up. I kind of disagree a little bit with Andrew in terms of the sun coming out, and I'll tell you why. To me, the major character in this film is the city of Philadelphia. And the arc that the city of Philadelphia enjoys in this movie is a dramatic arc, which is as great as Rocky's and Adrian's to me. There is such squalor in the beginning, and it's real squalor because I can tell you firsthand because I was teaching in South Philly in 1975, and this movie makes it look way worse than it actually did. And most of it shot, it seemed to me, at night. Most of the outdoor scenes are done at night. The sun really never comes out. It's so dismal and dark and rainy and miserable and horrible looking streets. And even the great street corner scene where they're singing is, nighttime. And toward the end, of course, as we move towards the end of the film, we see the beauty of Philadelphia. And a few shots of the art museum, and of course the wonderful, famous, iconic one, but that's shot at night as well. And I thought that was really interesting. There's very little about this movie that I find to be subtle, but some of that is quite subtle. And I actually think that some of the subtlety in the shooting of the city is maybe what makes this movie so powerful, because there's a line that's kind of going with that, that's taking us by the hand, and we can identify with where we live and the beauteous places of where we all live and those which aren't so nice. So I don't think the sun ever really comes out in this movie, and I think that's important, and I think that's very powerful. That the city looks gorgeous, and it's very grainy, or at least it was in the film version I watched, and it's twilight, so it isn't clear and sunlit, and yet it's really spectacular. So to me, the beauty of this movie has to be in part described through the city.
I think a lot of what you identified can at least partly, and again, Andrew should have better insight into this because I'm about to talk about filmmaking again, and I really should get out of the habit of doing this. But at least part of what you identified is probably related to budget. The extent to which to light things brightly, you need more lights, you need more crew, which means more money. I would imagine, though I don't know, that in some cases it's easier to shoot at night because you don't have to worry about traffic and all that stuff. So I think part of that was probably part of the things you described, Anna, were probably sort of facilitated or necessitated by the budget of the film. But on the other hand, that's perfectly, that still helps achieve the result. As many of you know, the reason you don't see the shark in Jaws until the times you do is because they couldn't get the mechanical shark to work. Turns out to make the movie much better than it would have been otherwise. So sometimes these things work to the film's advantage. Andrew.
Yeah, so there is a from a couple points. There's a reason why I chose this film. Number one, I've always loved this film and wanted to teach it, but there's a reason why I chose it now. And if you actually think about it, if you'll humor me, it's actually because we're all stuck in our houses. And there is no greater love letter to the city where we live or live right outside of than this film. And I wanted us to be able to fall in love with Philadelphia again and to kind of feel it from that perspective, especially right now. We have the ability to almost feel it as people in 76 who were not in Philadelphia at the time, watching it from other places because we're not, seeing the art museum every day. We're watching this on a screen in our house. So there was a little bit of consciousness in doing that and choosing this film at this time and where we all kind of are stuck. But yes, Dana, you are absolutely right. Philadelphia is a supporting character, if not a main character in this film. One thing I would point out is I don't think there's really any film or very few films that are so tied into their setting than Rocky. And it's because of that choice of how it's shot, how it is a character. But the other thing that I always like to point out is if you ask someone on the street who's the most famous sports figure to ever come out of Philadelphia, a good number of people may actually say Rocky Balboa a fictional character. Technically, if you actually think about it, he's the most famous thing to come out of our city when it comes to sports. And he never actually existed. I remember I was at the first game at the new Eagles Stadium, and they had Sylvester Stallone come out. It's like having Joe Frazier come out. They had Sylvester Stallone come out. He's an actor. He played a character who lived in Philly with an awful Philly accent. And yet, that's what we think about. That's what's so indelible about this movie. But to what Andrew's saying, a lot of times shooting at night is an indication of budget. Number one, it's much easier to lock down a set at night. And what that means is to close off a set for filming. Number two, it's easier for continuity. Continuity is a very big deal, obviously, in movies. And if you don't have the budget to either exterior light outside or to control the sun, you're better off shooting at night because you get a lot more continuity of times. You get about 6 hours every night at least to shoot. There's also in filmmaking, there's a time called magic hour, and it happens twice a day. It's the hour between, it's the hour of dawn before the sun rises, and it's the hour of dusk after the sun sets. You still have enough footage, you still have enough light to film without the harmfulness of shadows from the sun. And it's actually one of the times that a lot of movies are filmed. It's actually it is right about when the montage is filmed in the film is magic hour. The sun's not casting shadows yet, but it is bright enough to be giving you enough daylight. And so when you're making a movie, these are conscious things. Again, another example of, like you said for Jaws, the budget actually, or the filmmaking and the errors that happen during it actually making the film better.
We have John S. with his hand up. John.
Hi, I wanted to talk about religion. The movie begins with the theme before you see anything, and there's an extra little organ flourish that reminds you of a church. And then the very first scene is a depiction of Christ, and the camera pans down, and it says Resurrection AC. which is actually a real Los Angeles athletic club called Resurrection Athletic Club. And the story is a resurrection. Rocky resurrects his life. And he's the Italian stallion. So there's his Catholicism. It's an undertone. There's not a lot in the movie. And then one of the most powerful scenes, and this is just one of the many great threads that runs through the movie, is when Apollo is getting massaged and all his handlers are there in the locker room, getting rubbed down. Rocky's basically got Adrian and he's alone. And I think one of the most powerful scenes in the movie is when Rocky is kind of fidgeting and nervous, and he kneels down in front of the sink as if that's his altar, a dirty sink, in the spectrum. And he prays. And to me, that's a very moving thing that I think a lot of people in the city connected with. And that was, one of the part of the, inspirations for a lot of people to, really like the movie. Sorry, I'm eating. Andrew got me just when I was finishing my dinner.
No, I think you make a good point, John. And I think, of course, if we're going to talk about a character who achieves his goal by, in part, being able to withstand more punishment, certainly physical, but also in a way emotional, than any man is thought to have been able to withstand, then I think we can see another connection to religion as well. Andrew, did you have anything on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's very apparent that you don't begin a film with an image of Christ on the cross or Christ in general without trying to overtly say something about religion. And I do think that there's a parable there. And I think it's well executed because it's not so mentioned. It's implied at the beginning. We see it again. Obviously, it's a resurrection story, and you can kind of take that to the Rocky character. But this is intelligent filmmaking, and it's filmmaking that respects its audience. I'm reminded, I always love bringing up other films, but I'm reminded of the film Superman Returns and how blatant and overt the Christ parables were in that film, to the point that it really angered audiences. Here, they are there. They're obviously meant for us to see. And I really like what you said about the altar being a dirty sink. I think that's very impactful. But at the same time, they're not so blatantly presented to us. I prefer films that imply rather than, tell. And I think Rocky does that very well. You do. And I also love juxtaposition. And I think it's such great juxtaposition to go. So it's juxtaposition at the same time as parallelism, because you go from Christ and so you go from Christ down to the blood of this boxing match, the visceralness of a boxing match. But when you think, another image you think of Christ during crucifixion is the kind of a lot of blood and the blood from the nailing to the cross. And it's this interesting both kind of parallelism at the same time as this kind of juxtaposition and dichotomy. I love it.
I think it's also interesting when you mentioned the sink, and I think about there are a few scenes or a few moments in the film that take place in front of the sink, in front of the mirror. And there's one toward the beginning when Rocky comes back after that first fight we see, where he looks at the mirror and he's sort of assessing himself. And he's looking at a picture of himself as a boy, which I found really interesting. He's not looking at a picture of his father. He's not looking at a picture of some great boxer. He's not even looking at a picture of Jesus. He's looking at a picture of himself. And I think that your point about that sort of private space where he can focus on being alone with himself as being his altar is a very keen observation. Marty, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I do, as a matter of fact. I felt that one of the most poignant scenes in the movie was when Mickey shows up at Rocky's apartment, literally with his hat in his hand. He has his hat in his hand, asking Rocky if Rocky would let him be his trainer after Mickey finds out that Rocky has been, tabbed to be the opponent for Apollo. And then as Mickey is kind of retreating down the empty corridor, Rocky is just letting all of his frustration out. You know, Mickey has kicked him out of his locker, and Mickey has treated him, you know, kind of like a dog, because I think maybe Mickey saw potential, but then Rocky just became a thumb buster. And then Rocky does allow Mickey to train him. And I think that Mickey, in a lot of ways, was a father figure, because as we moved down into 2 and into 3, we realized that Rocky actually, you know, worships Mickey, loves Mickey, and Mickey was a security blanket. But that scene when he showed up at the apartment, you know, an old fighter with a lot of pride, you know, and you could just feel, but the hat in the hand was basically saying, I'm going to humble myself to hook up, you know, with Rock to give him a chance against this guy.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Marty. One of the things that Andrew said in his introduction, and he's repeated it tonight, that is true, is part of the reason this film has the power it does and engages people the way it does, is because it doesn't only have one interesting, compelling character. And the Mickey character doesn't have a lot of sort of screen time for his character's development, or to make us sort of care about him in anything approaching the way we might care about Rocky or Adrian. And so that scene has to do a lot of work. That scene has a sort of heavy lift required of it. And I think the things you described, as well as the seasoned actor like Burgess Meredith, really allows it to pull that weight sufficiently.
Yeah, I think so. We've spent a lot of time talking about how mistakes have been kind of incorporated into the film to become accidental successes. But I also think we need to realize in this film that there's an immense amount that is overt and important, and that the filmmakers were making, and there's an immense amount of symbolism. Rocky at that scene yells over and over again, "It stinks." And if you go about 2 scenes later, you have Paulie yelling the exact same thing in the meat locker. "It stinks. It stinks." This, actually, I'm sorry, not in the meat locker, it's in his home. But they do comment when they're in the meat locker about how it stinks in there as well. This idea of it stinking is really this blue collar rising up. If you're going to truly rise up to success, it's going to stink along the way. And I always found it so poignant that both characters say it very close to each other. And yes, I do see that I think the father figure is implied here. I think Rocky kind of gets it all out. He really, in my opinion, and I think it's very important that the picture of his parents is on that mirror. He yells, the things he's saying at Mickey are almost directed at the same way to his father and to him as a father figure. But it was mentioned at the beginning of this, and I just want to mention it again, that scene ends in one of my favorite ways. And that is that we see the lead up, we don't see the reconciliation. And it's actually almost in its design a copy of another one of my favorite scenes from another movie, and that is The Graduate. And that is, if you'll recall in The Graduate, there's the scene when Elaine and Ben go on their date, and they are kind of Ben is just rude to her, and we see that, and then this moment of reconciliation occurs inside a convertible that is actually has its top up. We never hear how they reconciled, how they fell in love, as it were. And it's similar there. That we don't need to see the reconciliation. It's actually more of a powerful moment. Sometimes you get more from less, from not seeing that. Because at the same time, if you're a filmmaker, how can you write dialogue that's going to end that scene? Hey, Mickey, I'm sorry. I would like you to train me. There's no way to do it. And yet the scene, you can end the scene without the dialogue, and all of a sudden, it's perfect. It brings it together. So it's a very important relationship and a very important scene, and how it's done.
Gary C., do you have a question or comment?
Other people's perspective. It has to do with the fact that my dad was a professional boxer for a period of time, and he trained me to box as well, just as self-defense. And I have to say that the fight scenes are very unrealistic, and I find that troublesome. I really like the movie in every other respect, but when these unrealistic elements enter in, it's like making a good baseball movie, except that the baseball is depicted inaccurately. just one example, I don't want to get into boring detail, but just a really glaring example is that Rocky doesn't ever guard himself with his right hand. He's left-handed, you know, and his right hand is down at his waist, and he's getting punched in the face, and he's not guarding his face with his other hand. And even the most amateurish boxer knows that's not what you do, you know, and you got to get your brains beaten out. And similarly, Apollo Creed's style degenerates into a kind of just a simply, I'll punch you in the face, now you punch me in the face, now punch me in the ribs, you know, that kind of thing. And that detracted from the movie for me. But I got the feeling I'm pretty much alone in this. And so I thought I'd make the observation and see, do you share this? Is this a problem for anyone but me?
Well, Gary, thanks for making the comment, and thanks for letting us know, particularly given your experience and perspective. And that's really the key to this, I think, is that you have that experience and perspective, and most of the rest of us don't. And that is that can be a real sort of challenge, a real kind of curse if there's something fictional that you're really interested in your sort of area of knowledge or expertise. You're going to be inherently disappointed by it. My father, before he retired, was a physician, and my mother and I would try to get him to watch ER with us when it was on. And we couldn't have tied him to a chair and gotten him to watch that show for much the same reason that Gary was turned off by the depiction of boxing. So it's unfortunate. I think the extent to which it doesn't bother most other people is an indication of the limited knowledge that most other people have about that particular sport. Andrew, do you have any quick thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I was literally going to say my father's a lawyer and would never watch Law and Order. And I remember I was about 7 years old, and I asked him, I said, you know, why don't you like law shows? And he goes, because I spend the entire time thinking about what they're doing wrong and what's not realistic. But I'm reminded, and Andrew knows how much I love Spielberg, I'm reminded of something that Spielberg said, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but Spielberg basically said that a film is like a letter. And once it's done, you seal it, you put it in the mail, and you mail it to your audience. And once they open it, it's theirs to make of what they'd like. Once you've done it, it's theirs. So that begs the question of, who do you make a movie for? And I always have argued that some of the best filmmakers have made a movie for themselves, that they make the movie that they're comfortable with, that they're proud of, that they want, fully knowing that the audience is going to bring a bunch of different things to it. I've mentioned this before, I think, but there's I saw a film called The Kids Are All Right with some friends who took a completely different view of the film than I did, all because their relationship that they had been in with other people reminded them of that, and they took it completely differently. So we're always going to see things differently, especially if we have that kind of experience. It is somewhat, there is in listening to the podcast and things about this, from a boxing perspective, it is very strange that nobody puts up defense. You know, there is no blocking. The gloves don't go up. But again, what makes a great film to me is the fact that you are willing to ignore its flaws. There's no such thing as a perfect movie. But if you're willing to ignore its flaws, and in this case its significant flaws, and yet still love the film or still watch the film, then you've got something. You've really got something.
Right, and there's a point to which this is all subjective. I mean, Perry in the chat mentions it's the willing suspension of disbelief and not necessarily a lack of knowledge about boxing that makes or lets Rocky work. And that's true, because you don't need to have a certain amount of expertise in an area necessarily to see some of the flaws in the logic of certain things or things like that. And the question is, has the movie sort of gotten you or not? And that's something that can differ down to an individual, can differ down to the circumstances of viewing, or how you were feeling before you walked in the theater. You know, we had this issue with the film last week, The Night of the Hunter, where a minority definitely was deeply gripped and engrossed by the film, and a significant number just couldn't connect with it, and they were watching it from a distance and couldn't suspend disbelief or ignore anything, you know, for its duration. And, you know, I think that, you know, if people could figure out how and why these connections are made or aren't, that whoever figured that out would be a very, very rich person. But so far nobody's been able to. And it's one of the things that makes movies so interesting, but also makes them so challenging, and is the reason why, as Andrew was saying, a filmmaker has to at some point say, I've done what I can do, or what I set out to do, or the most I can do, and now I'm sending it, now it has to be received.
And just if I may, just quickly on that, you're exactly right. Then the number one thing that any filmmaker has to do is suspend disbelief. If you can't suspend disbelief, you haven't succeeded. You can't make a film. That's literally what filmmaking is about. Is because you know that what you're watching is not real. You know that what you're watching is actors doing it. It's all designed. But if a filmmaker is really good, then they get you engrossed in what is a fictional story. And one thing that I argue about this film is that that's the point of the training montage, is that it is so well cut, so well edited, so well designed with that music, that at that point you're either going to buy in or you're not, and that's what's going to suspend your belief. Is that at that point, if you don't have your arms up cheering Rocky at the same time and you don't have the goosebumps, then the film's not going to work for you. But at that point, I'm willing to forgive the fact that, okay, really, the Italian Stallion, Rocky gets a shot at the heavyweight championship because he was picked out of a book for his name, and, you know, come on. Your Deus Ex Machina, your thing that has to happen in order to advance your story, your MacGuffin, as it were, very oftentimes is not believable. Yet you have to find some way to get your audience to buy in.
Daphne, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I was thinking about, you were talking about the reasons that you chose the film. And one of the things that resonated with me was just how very likable Rocky was, and all the small acts of kindness, not just to Adrian, but to all the relationships and the people on the street and the girl that he walks home. It just made you really care about him and want him to succeed.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he's a person, he's a character. We see many dimensions of him, and he doesn't neatly fit all into one box, though, you know, there's certain sort of he's reminiscent of certain characters. I always get a kind of a Marty vibe from his character, but you're right. There are those moments that show his sweetness, and in a way, that's one of the fascinating contrasts, and one of the challenges he faces as a character. You know, some people might say that he has too much sort of innate sweetness to sort of have the killer instinct, or as it would later be called, the eye of the tiger, to succeed in that field. And that's one of the things that maybe he wonders about himself, but he doesn't let that stop him. And that's one of the charming things about him. He doesn't seem to be sort of, you know, personality wise, you know, suited to a number of he's not suited to be a collection guy, and he's not suited perhaps to be a boxer, but the heart that makes him behave in those ways you just identified, Daphne, is the heart that serves him so well, I think, throughout the movie.
Not to get too philosophical, but one of the first things you learn in film school is that in order to make a film, you have to be inherently dishonest. You have to cheat. You are basically creating, and that's literally the purpose of montage. And I've done this in classes. If I show you a baby that is crying and I show you a poured glass of milk, we assume that the baby is crying because of the milk. They may be two completely separate shots shot years apart, but the mind puts two and two together. And when you've got 2 hours to get me, and really less, because I got to care about Rocky at least, that hope that he wins by the time the fight comes around. So if you've got less than 2 hours for me to care about a character who I've never met, never heard of, and is not based on, and is not a historical character, you've got to do it pretty overtly. And again, we end up forgiving it, but these things that he does, the kind of the taking of the girl, walking her home, all of these things, they're very schmaltzy. They're very on their nose. They're very obviously there for us to side with the character quickly, the not breaking of the thumbs, all of that. But it has to happen because we have to, in that amount of moment, we have to meet a character, fall in love with a character, and want that character to succeed. And that's not an easy task for any filmmaker to do. Obviously, in television, it's a little different. In television, you have multiple episode arcs to be able to do that. But even if you look at the pilot of a television series that is character-based, at some point during that first hour, you're going to have to give me something to care about that character. I'm never going to watch it again.
We did get some additional questions over email, and we'll definitely get to those, but I do want to go with the people who have their hands up right now. Mary, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, hi. So I'm really enjoying the discussion, and I wanted to ask about Philadelphia. One thing, was Philadelphia always the location for the film? And did it have anything to do with budget? You know, it would have been cheaper than New York. I think Stallone was living in Hell's Kitchen at the time, possibly. And then did it have anything to do with all of the buzz about the bicentennial coming up in '76, that it might have been a nice tie-in? So just curious about any backstory on why Philadelphia, because I completely agree. It's completely integrated into the film and its character. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew, do you have any intel on that?
Yeah, it was always going to be Philadelphia. Stallone attended school here. And this was a place that he had really experienced the culture. And I think in many ways that culture was what he wrote the character. He wrote Rocky with that culture in mind, that setting. He never really, it would have never really taken place anywhere else because and that's kind of how Philadelphia is such a part of it, such a major character, because he wrote that with that in mind. He did spend some of his formidable years here, kind of learning and growing in prep school and things like that. So absolutely written with Philadelphia in mind and became a very strong part of it.
Gary R., you have a question or comment?
Hi, yeah, this is Laura, I'm Gary's daughter. We're all listening. But I had a question. I wanted to know if you can talk about the film through the lens of like race and power. I'm specifically interested in why Apollo Creed decided that he wanted to pick a white man to fight with, and when he saw Italian Stallion, he's like, that's the guy. So I'm curious about that. There's also kind of some interesting imagery with Apollo Creed as like Uncle Sam, and I'm just kind of interested about, you know, race in this movie.
I think that's a really good question. I think that there's a certain extent to which we are supposed to see Apollo Creed as something resembling or approaching an analog to Muhammad Ali. And in that sense, we certainly get that in terms of how much he talks and how he refers to himself. But more importantly, I think the connection is that despite what the bartender in the bar where Rocky sees Apollo's press conference or interview, I guess, says, we're meant to, I think, come away with the impression that, as you said, when he's sort of dressed as Uncle Sam, this is a Black athlete who has been, to at least a significant extent, accepted by different communities. And he's clearly interested. I think Apollo stopped short of explicitly stating it, but he strongly implies, and he may make a comment about it, that he wants there to be a racial component to this because it is good business. And I think that the notion of Rocky not just being white, but of being of a background that Rocky himself so specifically identifies with, as to have it be part of his nickname, makes him an all the more appealing sort of person for Apollo to kind of execute this grand strategy he has for the event. Andrew, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Apollo does say it. He says, you know, this is, and he implies it and he says it, but it's one of the great ironies that I've always found in this film is that it's almost race reversed. The champion is an African American. It is someone who has gone an immense amount of success. If you think about each character with their own road to success, Apollo has reached his road to success. He transcended his past, and obviously the tumult of the 60s to become a black heavyweight fighter, just like Ali did. And I think that's very important. But I also think his portrayal is very important, because it could be so easy to portray him as the evil black boxer. But to me, Apollo, and one thing that I love about this film is that Apollo is not really a villain. There really is no villain in this film. Apollo is even a character that you kind of like. Yes, he's a little misguided. He's not paying attention to the right things, but it's not like he ever does something where you're like, oh, I don't like him anymore. He's always smiling. He's always treats Rocky with some respect. Yeah, he does make that funny joke about if he could cook. But even at the end when he says, ain't going to be no rematch, that's basically Apollo saying, there's no way I'm going to fight you again, because you can hold your own. You are as good as me. And of course, there is a rematch, which completely ruins the line in the second movie, but that's like this important line. And Rocky says, I don't need one, don't want one. It's very interesting how the characters are made.
Yeah, I think you've identified one of the key differences between this film and some of the sequels, which is they make the opponent a villain, and they make there be this clear villain, when what this is basically a character study, and it makes the character study all the more interesting a harder story to tell in a movie, but a more interesting one when the story is more about the character kind of against himself and against these odds that are out there. Michael, do you have a question or comment?
All right, let me unmute there. I have a comment for you. It's funny, you just brought it up about the villain. There's no villains in this, and I agree there's no overt villains, but to me, the villains here were always the people's past, Rocky's past, Mickey's past, Philadelphia's past. And Philadelphia could have been any American city, could have been Detroit, could have been New York. You talked about Taxi Driver, how grim that is, what a terrible view of New York City that is at the time. And that's why I love the movie so much. I saw it first as a 10-year-old at the Ardmore Movie Theater, and split decision we thought was a tie at the end. I thought that's brilliant where they call it a split decision, because yeah, he lost the fight, but he won so much more than that. And he was fighting not just for himself, but to fight the past that he had underachieved with, fighting for Mickey, fighting for Philly, and in maybe a corny way, kind of fighting for America. So love the movie. Every time I watch it now, I see something different in it. And thanks for all the dialogue tonight.
Sure, thank you. Now I think maybe we'll turn to some of the questions that we kind of got online. In particular, BJ has a couple talking really about the kind of trajectory of the Rocky character and of the series in general. And I think that we've touched on some of these points. The idea, in fact, that the film and frankly this kind of becomes kind of Stallone's kind of cottage industry, and I think that just as characters change, filmmakers and stars can change, and I think he sort of, as Andrew mentioned in his introduction, we come to think of Stallone as an action star, and if you think of him that way and then you come and watch this film that we all just watched, one thing that is surprising about it is how little action there is and how little fighting there is, and that wasn't going to fly as people's perception of him, but even his perception of himself, I think, perhaps more importantly, changed. And there's only so many times you can tell the same story, so he felt compelled to add all these additional elements of different generations and the Cold War and all those sorts of things, because he has to find a variation on the theme. And I think we would all agree that none of them is as successful as the original, because there was something about the simplicity and to use an overused term, the purity of the original. Andrew, you said that you didn't want to look at the whole series because you like to think of this film sort of as a standalone, and I certainly can understand that and would acknowledge that. I think it should be thought of as its own entity, particularly because that's how it was initially devised, right? But could you speak very briefly about, sort of what sort of unfolds moving forward, and how, I think for lack of a better term, it kind of goes off the rails?
Yeah, I mean, there is, well, one thing I want to mention and kind of bring to that is, I've always found Stallone to be very fascinating, because a lot of us remember it, not a lot of us think about it, but like you talked about, like I mentioned, the man wrote and starred in a film that won Best Picture, nominated for Best Actor, nominated for Best Screenplay, probably would have won Best Screenplay if not for Patty Chayefsky. Nothing was going to be network. But, unlike Arnold Schwarzenegger and some of our other action heroes, this is a person who really began with an immense amount of critical acclaim. Went on to direct Rocky II, and it's a very well-directed film. Maybe, it's an unnecessary film, but it's a well-directed film. You think of him, and I think because of his face and because of how he talks and how he carries himself, you think of him as this brooding guy with no intelligence. But Stallone himself is a very talented filmmaker. He's a very good director. I mean, The Expendables and the other films that he's done later on, even those are good. But it all comes to the series does go off the rails. Doesn't mean that I don't like it. I mean, I'll watch Rocky IV any day of the week. If Rocky wants to win the Cold War for us, Rocky and Reagan run the Cold War is one of the old jokes. It's great. It's just great movies, but it's not. We're not going to teach a class on Rocky IV unless we're talking about Cold War era cinema. It does go off the rails. They need more stories, and at that point, it becomes about money. At that point, it becomes, look, this is a franchise that made 200% profit. We're going to keep making them. We'll find some stories. We'll find some redemption, but we're going to keep making them.
Right.
And yeah,
I think one of the appealing things about Creed, and one of the reasons why that movie was so well received by audiences and critics, is because it sort of went back to the beginning. And frankly, Stallone didn't write that, and he certainly wasn't involved in sort of overseeing that production to any significant degree. You had a tremendously skilled filmmaker in Ryan Coogler, who found the property and this new character attractive, and and Stallone does a good job in those movies as an actor, but sometimes you need to kind of turn over the reins, and he did that with Creed, and I think that's sort of what brought things back to a film that was approaching the style, if not perhaps the success or originality of the original Rocky. We have a couple more comments. Dana, did you have another comment? Okay.
No, I don't.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. Gary C., do you have another comment? Okay, then a couple more email questions before we wrap up.
Andrew, I just want to say just very quickly, just on the series as a whole, it is, if you actually don't think about the individual movies, but think about the character, and if you were to read a biography of Rocky Balboa, it is a very interesting character because of the journey that he takes from nothing to rising up, becomes so successful, uses that success, kind of loses all his money, has to redeem himself in Rocky Balboa, and then rebirths and reboots in Creed to it. So it is, I'm not saying that, I don't want you to think like we shouldn't make the other films. It's actually very interesting, the journey as a franchise that he takes. But without that first film, you wouldn't have anything of it.
Right, and I agree with you. It's a very interesting journey. It's just some chapters of that journey could have been told in a better way than they were. One question was from Bill, saying it appeared that the transition of Rocky from being hopeless and practicing detrimental behaviors to being more hopeful and more self-sustaining happened rather instantaneously. and that his sort of self-destructive or bad behavior stopping suddenly seemed unrealistic. And I would say that I didn't consider him to be a self-destructive person by nature. I think if you, granted, he doesn't, he's not always sort of the healthiest, but there's nobody who's sort of, in, a single person in their, even in their late 20s back then, perhaps didn't always eat their vegetables, so to speak. But, I think that what changes on a dime is his opportunity and the realization that there are people around him or people he knows like Mickey and like the encouragement he gets from others, that he could really has a chance to do something, not to win, but he has a chance to do something, to change his station, to achieve something the way he's never achieved something before. And that could be tremendously motivating. And this is for a character who always had some degree of faith in himself and some degree of optimism about his future. So I don't find it so surprising that he could, kind of turn on a dime that way, because he had those motivations.
I mean, if you extrapolate Mickey as the father character, and you kind of take that he gets his shot and then almost reunites with his father starts caring for him. He has a father figure that's caring for him. The story changes at that point too. All of a sudden he has something worth fighting for, someone believing in him. He's got multiple people that care about his success. And it's another story kind of about how the people around us push us higher and contribute to our success. That's why the other characters are so important in this. And that's why that scene with Mickey is so important, because it is almost a reuniting, a forgiving of his father, and now all of a sudden he does. So it's not that his character necessarily turns. It's like Andrew says, the situation turns and allows us to explore another element of him.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I think we are going to leave it there. We went a little bit over today, but we had a lot of interesting comments. People obviously have a lot of thoughts and feelings about this film. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. If you want to find out what else we're doing at Bryn Mawr Film Institute, even though the building's closed, we've got a lot happening online. We have the Theater 5 section on brynmawrfilm.org, the Film Studies Online section on brynmawrfilm.org, and every week we do another film and another discussion. So this Thursday in our weekly Thursday email, next week's film will be announced and the introduction will be linked. So please sign up for our weekly emails and also visit brynmawrfilm.org to see what else we're doing. And thank you very much for tuning in and staying engaged with us and helping us have this great conversation. And thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us as well.
My pleasure, my honor, as always. Best wishes of safe and health to everyone. But like we said, there's always a silver lining, and I think we're all watching a few more movies or binging a few more TV shows. So at least we're getting to enjoy that aspect of our lives. So honored and thank you, and some great stuff from the class. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.